The second keynote of the day will be given by Ashish Goel, who is a professor of management science and engineering and computer science at Stanford University. His research interests lie in the design, analysis, and applications of algorithms. Current application areas include social networks, participatory democracy, internet commerce, and large-scale data processing. Professor Goel has prolific work in the space of resource allocation, and he combines optimization methods with mechanism design and social choice theory. So today, Professor Goel will talk about fairness in social choice and the public resource allocation.
So thanks a lot for inviting me. The work that I'm going to talk about has actually been influenced, at least my thinking has been influenced a lot by the MD4SG group. And so it's a pleasure to present here. The talk is going to be mostly around this one issue of fairness in social choice and participatory democracy. It's been a long-term project, so it's a joint work with a lot of people. The main work that I'm going to touch upon is with Nikhil Garg and Ben Plout, but everybody else's work I might also mention along the way. So there are two types of fairness. Fairness is a very complex concept, and they're not just two types, but many, many types. And hence I put this in quotes. But there are two broad types that are interesting when you think about social choice. One is about fair participation, which is about people having equal or equitable voice. Yeah? And of course, these things need definitions. And the other is about fair outcomes. That is the epistemic fairness, where the focus in the second one is not so much about did everyone have an equal voice, but were the outcomes good for society in general or fair across various groups. So one example where we personally wrestle with this quite a bit is participatory budgeting. It's a process which emphasizes the role of citizen involvement in political decision making. It's also a bit more complex than regular voting because in budgeting, there's always a certain amount of money that you can spend. So you can think of participatory budgeting as basically voting under constraints. We have a platform for this, which is open source and free. I've talked about this platform many times in many venues, so I'll skip this. Just want to mention this platform exists. It's sort of become the de facto platform in North America, at least in the US, for participatory budgeting. And we have been used in sort of over 100 elections. And as soon as you start to do something like participatory budgeting, any kind of participatory process, this notion becomes very salient, which is what is equitable participation. And there are theoretical and empirical questions in this area, but I feel like the most important questions are normative. Is it important for a civic process, for example, participatory budgeting, to have equitable distribution among demographic groups? For example, you could imagine that a random set of residents participate. How do you correct for a biased sample? And should you correct for a biased sample? And I'm going to give you some examples of situations where it's more clear that you should and some where it's not so clear that you should. And then theoretically / empirically, how do you choose such a set under two common real life situations, right? So for example, when the participants are recruited via online advertising and when the participants are self-selected. And both of them come with their own sort of complex choices. And I just want to point out that this problem is complex and worth studying, even when the organizers of the process can choose a set of participants explicitly. So even if I can go and say, well, you, and you can vote, and you, and you will not vote. Even then the problem is complex, but these normative issues are much more salient when these participants are recruited either via things like online advertising or online outreach, or when the participants are self-selected. So for example, voting in participatory budgeting in cities, and this is not just about digital participatory budgeting. This is also about if you do it in person on paper, can skew richer and whiter. And so one approach could be to correct for this proactively via tools such as neighborhood canvassing and online advertising. And we have preliminary experimental and theoretical results in equitable online advertising, for example, in last year's MD4SG. But the main questions again in my mind are normative. Which demographic should be advertised to? And this is especially complex given the intersectional complexity of the differences. So for example, often if you advertise for racial minorities, and you also advertise to women, if you want to sort of, often what ends up happening is that you end up getting a lot of racial minorities who are women, where the people who are not participating might actually, for example, be African American men. And so the simple question of which demographic should we advertise to becomes quite salient. Should we look for every possible intersection of gender and race and income and age, which becomes intractable, or should we somehow focus on specific intersections, and if yes, which ones? Should we shoot for, in online advertising, should we shoot for equitable views across all demographics? Or should we shoot for equitable spending? Or should we shoot for equitable clicks? Or should we shoot for equitable votes? Okay. And then, of course, another approach is to correct for the demographic skew retroactively. I don't want to focus on our empirical results. I want to, in this area, I want to sort of focus your attention on the normative questions. And hence, if anybody has any observations to make, please do feel free to sort of chime in or ask a question, and I'll try to monitor the chat as I'm going along. So here's an example of a situation where you could correct for the demographic skew retroactively. In general, there are processes which are structured like elections. And when things are structured like elections, generally you don't have the option of going back retroactively and correcting the results. Because there's a very strong culture with elections, which is one person, one vote, which is if somebody voted, then their vote counts. Yeah. Elections are often anonymous, so you don't actually even know who voted, right? But there are also processes which are not structured as elections. They're structured as feedback to a decision-making organization. And there often you have this opportunity to correct for the demographic skew retroactively, as opposed to proactively get a balanced sample. So here's an example. We were asked to help with the crowdsourcing Finland's off-road traffic law. This was 6 or 7 years ago. And the question here was, should snowmobilers be allowed to go on private forests in the winter when much of Finland is snowed in? And the only way to get to places from one place to another is via snowmobile. Should hunters be allowed to hunt there? And if yes, then what should be sort of the regulation that governs it? Yeah. And so immediately the question arises, should we look for demographic skews and should we correct for them in the results? And it's important to wrestle with this question sort of in advance before you actually see the results. And if you decide after you look at the results that you know you need to correct for demographic skews, then there seems to be like something normatively inappropriate around it. So in this particular case, as it turns out, we had lots of questions. We had like hundreds of questions. As you can see, there's 16 out of 101 completed. What would be the best way to situate snowmobile routes? Right? And people could sort of compare two different ideas. They could also rate ideas. So there were like hundreds of actions that they were required to do. And when you do hundreds of actions, then you can do clustering, because each person who votes gives you 100 points, or let's say 50 points. So they give you like a lot of data points. When each person who votes gives you that much information, you can cluster people without worrying about what the original demographics was. Okay? And this is what we call unsupervised minorities. And the name unsupervised comes from unsupervised clustering. Right? We don't actually have any upfront notion, a priori notion of what a minority is. We find these minorities based on opinion. Yeah? And then we detect these minority clusters in opinion space. And optionally, we can see whether they correlate with demographics. And the question immediately arises, should we do it? Should we report this to the decision maker? If we find demographic skew in these unsupervised minorities, is it useful? Should that be considered in decision making? In this particular case, as it turns out, the minorities that we found were, the minority cluster was women, environmentalists, and landowners. And like Finland is a fairly balanced country, so there's no way women should be in the minority, right? But clearly the people who were highly motivated to come and participate in this election were people who were snowmobilers, because this had the most direct impact on them. And in fact, for various outcomes, the red results are the results from the majority cluster, the blue results are the results from the minority cluster. So the results would indeed change of the whole process could indeed change if we do correct for this demographic skew. Now, in this particular case, this was not very politically charged, so we had the luxury of just reporting the results to a parliamentary committee in Finland, and they, I don't quite know what they did, how they took this minority majority issue into account, but we just sort of pointed this out in the report that we wrote. But in my mind, even though we did it, it's still not clear in my mind whether this was normatively the right thing to do or not. Right? If a motivated minority decides to show up in a participatory process and vote far more in excess of their demographic representation, is there something to celebrate or is there something to correct for? So here's another example of the same kind of potential skew in terms of who participates. So we were asked to sort of design a participatory budgeting survey for Austin. And I emphasize the fact that this was a survey and not an election. Our platform is generally used for participatory budgeting elections. In this case, it was a survey in the sense that the results were going to go to the mayor and the budget committee and the city planners, and we're going to publish them, but they were not going to be a binding election. And so the city sort of essentially put its entire budget in the survey, like what should we cut money for, what should we add money for, right? So in May 1, 2020, a survey launched with modest responses, an average of like 26 a day till May 28th. Yeah. And 26 sounds like a low number, but it's actually not that low. This is typically what surveys elicit. Like a few thousand responses is generally a good survey. On May 25, 2020, George Floyd got murdered. On May 28, 2020, there were protests across the US about this. There were a number of tweets about the budget survey, including the fact that police funding was on the survey. So there was like a targeted Twitter campaign to encourage people who were not comfortable with the amount of police funding in Austin or the policing practices in Austin to go and participate in the survey. And the number of responses increased dramatically. So from around 26 a day, it went to around 3,400 a day. On June 15th, we had a preliminary report which we shared with the city leadership. On June 17th, the city manager announced a series of actions to address policing. On July 13th, the city manager's budget was presented, and the budget included a 2.5% cut in police funding, which was roughly the level from the survey. So, I mean, it's hard to draw. Our survey was just one input into the decision making, right? So I don't want to claim that our survey had a direct causal connection or the only causal connection to this decision. But our survey was clearly consequential in this policy. It was definitely one factor that they took into account. And so then again, looking at the results, these are what the results look like. Right? So if you look at the first 200 responses, which were like well before the George Floyd murder, right? And the last 200 responses, which was well after all the protests took place. If you look at the first 200 responses and you focus on the Austin Police Department, you'll see this big bulb in the middle. And what this big bulb shows is that most of the intensity was at neither reducing nor increasing the police budget, but keeping it sort of where it was. And there was a small amount that people were sort of interested in, which was there's a small amount that people were interested in cutting, which is sort of this point on the left. In the last 200 responses, the vast majority of people who voted wanted to cut the police budget, and they wanted to cut it by the maximum allowed on our platform. We hadn't anticipated people wanting to cut the budget by that much when we designed the survey. And so you can see like a clear shift in the first 200 responses and the last 200 responses. And I think I could tell you like the demographics of the people who voted, but it'll be great to sort of, I would love to get to a point where we have a normative answer to this question without actually looking at the demographics of the people who voted, which is, should we look for demographic skews and should we correct for them in the results? And as you can see, at least my instinct in this particular situation is that the people who voted were sort of motivated by sort of deeply held beliefs. And if they came and voted, we should respect the fact that they voted or participated in the survey, and we should not try to correct for a demographic skew, right? But in general, I think it'll be useful if, as a community, if we could come up with more normative guidance on this, right? And more affirmative normative guidance. And by affirmative normative guidance, I mean not just something which gives you like high-level ethical principles that you should aspire to, but something that actually gives you concrete guidelines, yeah, and perhaps concrete quantitative measures that you could aspire to. So that was the first part of my talk. The second part of my talk is about a very stylized model which deals with epistemic fairness. And since we are running behind, I was going to stop here for questions, but since we are running behind, I'll keep going, do the second part of my talk, and then ask for questions.
There's one question in the Q&A.
Okay.
Definitely. So the question is, thanks so much for your work around participatory budgeting. Is absolutely fascinating and important. Do you think that this sort of survey platform implicitly or explicitly supports majority rule? I'm thinking about the outrage around critical race theory, which is due to the misinformation in a vocal minority.
Yes, I mean, it does. One person, one vote is generally structured like majority rule. And things like participatory budgeting do promote majority rule. And as do most of the systems that are currently structured as elections. And whether they should or not is precisely the kind of normative question that we would like to get guidance on. Right? But what would, as people who design these systems, so ideally we would like to sort of design the best possible systems that we can. As people who design these questions, we would love the normative guidance that we get to be independent of the question that's being asked on the platform. And I realize this is not always possible. I realize that this is a sort of a complex space, but to the extent possible, we would like the normative guidance to be independent of the question. This notion of sort of majority, this notion of sort of majority versus majority rule versus minority voice. And here I don't mean like majority versus minority necessarily among demographic groups. It could just be along any axis. It could be along sort of ideological axis, any kind of opinion axis. I think that's like a central question that we should answer. And these kinds of questions are generally easier to answer in an epistemic setting. So what do I mean by an epistemic setting? Where you're looking not for necessarily for equitable participation, but you're looking for equitable outcomes. Yeah. And when you're looking for equitable outcomes, then it's easier to make stylized models. And so what I'm going to do is to give you one such stylized model, right? Point out this conflict between sort of one person, one vote and fair epistemic outcomes. And then also give you one possible design that overcomes it. I want to point out that the first part of the talk raises these broad normative questions. The second part of the talk is going to be very stylized. It's going to focus on like one specific model. Can people see my screen? I should say markets for public decision making. Yeah. So I'm sorry, I couldn't figure out how to get this schooling to work. So imagine you are engaging in a public decision making process, and imagine that you're voting on it. Yeah. And let's assume that there are many items on the ballot. Think of it almost like the California proposition system for people who are familiar with it. Okay. And we're going to assume a utility model, right? And you'll immediately notice this big switch from having these high-level ideas to having these very concrete notation. And this is basically often what happens when you go from from equity in participation or from more normative ideas to sort of more stylized models of epistemic fairness. So user I, let's say, has binary preferences over the issues, right? And a weight WIL bigger than 0 for issue L, okay? So there are many issues. The user has binary preferences over the issues, so wants this side or that side, and has a weight which is basically how importantly does it want it, right? And so I'm not going to go into more details of the utility model, but basically a user's utility is WIL on issue L if the favorite thing happens and 0 if the non-favorite thing happens. So one person, one vote, which is what the question was alluding to, generally sort of leads to majority rule. Give each person a single vote on each issue and select the outcomes which receive the most votes. It's fair in some sense. It's fair in the sense of people having equitable voice, but it lacks expressiveness because people can't actually express how important something is to them and can often lead to very suboptimal outcomes. So here's a running example. So imagine that there are 3 issues on the ballot and there are just 3 voters. and each issue has two sides. On each issue, there's one voter who's on the minority and two in the majority, and every voter is the minority on exactly one issue. This is not so much, hence this is not so much about demographic minorities, it's much more about opinion minorities. But let's say the utilities are 4 when on an issue comma voter basis, when the voter is in the minority, and 1 when it's in the majority. So what that means is, in this particular case, A and B on issue 1 have utility 1, right? And C on issue 1 has utility 4. So C really cares much more about this issue. Okay? Now, of course, if you're doing majority voting, then on every issue, side 1 will win. Okay? And then everyone is 50% off because everyone has utility 2 as opposed to 4. And this is what people often refer to, which is was alluded to, is called the tyranny of the majority, which is because you're making majority rules in every decision, you can leave the minority behind. And what this example shows is that this can actually leave the whole society worse off, not just one particular group. If you assume that when people are in the minority, they're in the minority because they have some unique need which makes that particular issue more important to them. Then you can also imagine using a market, right? So markets are sort of a true way of, are a tested way of sort of expressing your preferences, right? So you could imagine there being some kind of a market where people can express their preference on various issues. So in a market, each player has in general in a market, and this is not a public decision market. This is, I'm thinking of a goods market, like you go to the market to buy fruit. Each player has a budget that they wish to spend, and let's assume they have no value for leftover money. This is typically called a Fisher market. You assume that goods are divisible, and here we are assuming they're private goods, like what you buy, you get. What I buy, I get. It's not like a public decision setting where we all make a joint decision. And so in market equilibrium is this notion where each good has a price and each player buys a favorite bundle, and there always exists an equilibrium, and it's not immediately obvious, so the demand meets supply. So the price is such that when everybody buys their favorite bundle, then the demand meets supply. And in fact, this equilibrium maximizes Nash welfare. That is, it maximizes the sum of the log of the utilities for every player. And maximizing Nash welfare is often used as an approach to obtain fair allocations. So it's reasonable to say, well, maybe we can use the same kind of market approach to obtain epistemically fair outcomes in public decision making. So then our goal is to design a mechanism for public decision making based on private goods markets. It's going to be more expressive than one vote. And I just want to point out the one worry whenever we talk about markets in public decision making is whether people can purchase political influence. And I just want to point out that this is, each person will get an equal endowment of voting dollars. So these are not people voting with real money, they're voting with monopoly money. And this money can only be used for this public decision market. There's no value outside. So this is not really about citizens purchasing political influence, it's just making a token-based market out of one person, one vote. Yes. So first attempt is to assume that these issues are divisible / randomized. Assume that each issue has a price, and each player can use their budget to buy probability. Okay? And if there's a total, if the people on the left side of an issue buy 0.4 and the people on the right side of an issue buy 0.6, then with 40% probability you choose the left side, with 60% probability you'll choose the right side. So let's see what the simple market leads to. And now let's look at the situation where the minority side, the side with the minority opinions, has utility 1.1 when they're in the minority, but then people when they're in the majority, they have utility 1. Okay. And so by symmetry, because this thing is very symmetric, the price is going to be identical. Now, if the price is identical, let's say the price is P for issue 1. So it costs you P units of money to put your vote on issue 1 on either this side or that side. Okay. Then if you focus on, say, let's say if you focus on voter C, okay, voter C says, well, my utility here is 1.1. My utility here is only 1. So let me put my entire dollar here, B will put the entire dollar there, and A will put the entire dollar here. And so the equivalent will be 100% side 2. And in this case, everyone is 45% worse, right? And this extends to a factor of n. Because the difference in utilities was so minor, it would have been better if the decisions were all on side 1. But in fact, the decisions in this simple public market are going to end up being on side 2. Okay? And again, everybody is going to be much worse off. So just by going from 1%, 1 vote to markets does not actually solve the underlying issue. You can solve the underlying issue using a different design. But if I could get a time check, it'll be really useful. I'm sorry, I lost track of.
No worries, Ashish. If you can wrap up in the next couple of minutes, that'd be great. So we can continue to the next session afterwards.
Okay. So in the simple market, this problem that we saw is similar to the free rider problem, which is basically when there are two people on one side. Okay? For example, focus on A and C being on the same side in issue 2. Then C doesn't want to really put their money on issue 2 because issue 1 is more important to them. Voter A doesn't want to put their money on issue 2 because issue 3 is more important to them, right? But collectively, issue 2 is more important to A and C collectively, but they can't they're not able to sort of coordinate that. They are all making their own decisions. And that's the problem with designing the simple market. And while this market might seem overtly simplified, it's actually not that. It does capture one aspect of our current society, which is that a lot of times, because voters are not voting directly, a lot of times the way voters express their opinion might be, say, for example, by going to a protest, right? Or by calling their congressman or congresswoman or congressperson. Or by writing a letter to an editor. But all these things require effort, right? So even though we live in this 1 person, 1 vote world, the way we express our political opinions is under the constraint, and the constraint is our own time and attention. And so you can imagine that while this is a very stylized example, you can imagine that this is what explains why this might be one reason why people often focus on some fringe issues which are not necessarily important to them, like gun rights, as opposed to issues which might be more important to them collectively, such as, say, Medicare. I'm going to sort of not describe our market design. The market design idea basically is that make everyone on one side essentially bargain with everyone else on the other side. And so there is a market design that we can come up with. It's a more complex market. The main result is that we can come up with a market design which can maximize national welfare. The results are in a paper. This result is actually a couple of years old by now. Okay? And since I didn't describe the actual mechanism, I don't think the actual theorem will make that much sense. Okay? But in conclusion, we can use these market design methods to design mechanisms for like fair public decision making in an epistemic sense, right? Where it's not necessarily fair in terms of how much voice you have, but it's more fair in the sense of what outcomes are achieved. These are very stylized and complex. And so future work would be to make things which are more practical. They're easy to understand, iterative, deterministic, which are more scalable. And also we have to realize that the cognitive load of these complex mechanisms can itself be a deterrent, right? And lead to unfairness. And so simpler approaches are better. And like I said before, it'll be great to have more affirmative normative guidance, like normative principles that are sufficiently well specified that you can use them to actually design a system. I'm going to stop here.